The hall went silent the moment Elena Marsh stepped through the tall wooden doors, and she felt every pair of eyes turn toward her like a wave crashing on rock. She had never wanted to be seen. She had wanted to disappear into the crowd, stand at the back, and leave before anyone noticed a rogue's daughter had walked into the choosing ceremony of the Blackthorn pack. But the moment she crossed the threshold, something in the air shifted, and every wolf in that room turned their head at once. She did not know why until she looked up and found him. Alpha King Damien Ashworth stood on the raised platform at the front of the hall, tall and still, his dark eyes locked on her as if the rest of the room had vanished. His jaw tightened, his hands curled at his sides. And then his eyes changed color, gold bleeding into the brown, the unmistakable sign of a wolf recognizing his mate. Elena's heart slammed against her chest. She had heard stories about the mate bond her whole life, whispered by other rogues around campfires, always describing it as warmth, as certainty, as home. What she felt instead was a pull so sudden and so strong that her knees nearly buckled. A thread, invisible but solid, stretched between her chest and his, tightening with every second that passed. Whispers spread through the hall like fire through dry grass. That's her? The Alpha King's mate? She's a rogue. Look at her clothes. He can't possibly accept her. Elena wanted to run. She had walked into this ceremony, hoping only for a place to belong. Not for this. Not for hundreds of eyes weighing her worth in an instant. She looked at Damien again, silently begging him with her eyes to say something, to claim her, to end the humiliation building in her chest before it swallowed her whole. Instead, his expression hardened. He stepped down from the platform, and the crowd parted for him like water. He walked until he stood only a few feet away, and for one breathless moment, Elena thought he might reach for her hand. She thought he might say the words that would change everything. He did not. "I reject you as my mate," Damien said, his voice steady and cold, carrying to every corner of the silent hall. The bond inside Elena's chest tore apart with a violence she had never imagined. It was not a quiet unraveling. It felt like something inside her had been ripped out by force, leaving a raw, screaming emptiness where the thread had been only seconds before. She staggered back, pressing a hand to her chest as if she could hold herself together. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some wolves looked at her with pity. Others looked away entirely, as though her humiliation was too uncomfortable to witness. A few smirked, satisfied that a rogue's daughter had been put back in her place. Elena did not wait to hear what came next. She turned and pushed her way through the crowd, ignoring the hands that reached out, ignoring the voices calling after her. She ran out of the hall and into the cold night air, her breath coming in ragged gasps, tears burning at the edges of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall in front of anyone who might still be watching. Behind her, in the hall, Damien stood frozen in place. He did not move even as the crowd began to murmur around him, even as his council members exchanged satisfied glances at his decision. He stared at the doors Elena had disappeared through, and the hollow place inside his own chest, where the bond had briefly lived, ached in a way he had never expected. He had known this moment was coming for months. His father, before his death, had made him promise that the next Alpha King of Blackthorn would secure the pack's future through a strategic marriage, not through the unpredictable whims of fate. Damien had agreed, believing he would never actually face a true mate bond, believing it was a story told to children, not something that would appear in his own life with such devastating clarity. Now he understood exactly what he had thrown away. His beta, a steady and quiet wolf named Owen Hart, appeared at his side, his expression unreadable. "You felt it," Owen said quietly, not a question. Damien did not answer. He simply turned and walked back to the platform, forcing his face into the calm, commanding expression his pack expected of their king. Inside, something had cracked, and he was not sure it would ever fully close again. Elena did not stop running until she reached the edge of the pack's outer territory, far from the grand hall, far from the wolves who had watched her humiliation unfold. She found herself standing near a row of old wooden kennels. the scent of straw and animals thick in the air, and she pressed her back against the rough wood, sliding down until she sat on the cold ground. The pain in her chest had not faded. If anything, it had settled into a dull, constant ache, a reminder of what had been taken from her before she had even understood what she was being given. She wrapped her arms around her knees and stared out into the darkness, wondering, not for the first time in her life, why she never seemed to belong anywhere. She had grown up moving from territory to territory with her father, a rogue wolf who had never been accepted into any pack, always searching for a place that might finally take them in. When he died, Elena had continued the search alone, carrying his restlessness and his hope that somewhere a pack would open its doors to her. She had heard the Blackthorn pack was different, more open to outsiders than most, and she had traveled for weeks to reach the choosing ceremony, hoping only for the smallest chance of a home. She had not expected to find her mate. She certainly had not expected to be rejected by him in front of an entire hall of strangers. A soft whine broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to find a young pup peering at her from between the kennel bars, its dark eyes curious and unafraid. Elena wiped at her face quickly, embarrassed even though no one else was around to see her. "Hey there," she whispered, forcing a small smile onto her face. "You're not scared of me, are you?" The pup pressed its nose against the bars, tail wagging slowly, and Elena felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. Animals had never judged her the way people did. They did not care about bloodlines or rank or whether her clothes were patched and worn. They simply existed with her, without expectation. She stayed there long into the night, talking quietly to the pup, telling it things she would never say aloud to another wolf. She spoke about her father, about the years of wandering, about the ache in her chest that refused to fade no matter how many hours passed. The pup listened, or seemed to, tilting its head at the sound of her voice, and for a little while, Elena felt less alone than she had in years. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, Elena finally stood, brushing dirt from her clothes. She knew she could not simply disappear into the territory forever. She needed shelter, she needed food, and more than anything, she needed a reason to stay that had nothing to do with the wolf who had broken her heart in front of an entire pack. She found the kennel master, an older wolf named Harold, tending to the animals just after dawn. He looked at her with tired eyes that held no judgment, only mild curiosity. "You're the rogue girl," he said simply, "from last night." Elena stiffened, waiting for the insult, the pity, the dismissal she had come to expect. Instead, Harold only shrugged. "I need help around here," he said. "The pups need feeding, the kennels need cleaning, and my knees aren't what they used to be. You willing to work?" Elena blinked, caught off guard by the simple, practical offer. "You're not worried about who I am? About last night?" Harold snorted. "Last night has nothing to do with whether you can carry a bucket of feed. Are you willing to work or not?" For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn territory, Elena felt something other than shame settle into her chest. She nodded, quickly, before he could change his mind. "Yes, I'm willing." And so began her new life at the edge of Blackthorn territory, far from the grand hall and the golden-eyed king who had rejected her before hundreds of witnesses, but close enough that she could still feel the faint, torn edges of a bond that refused to disappear completely, no matter how hard she tried to forget it existed. Weeks passed, and Elena settled into a rhythm at the kennels that gave her days a shape they had never had before. She woke before sunrise to feed the pups, cleaned the pens with quiet efficiency, and spent long afternoons repairing fences and hauling supplies under Harold's watchful but undemanding eye. The work was hard, her hands blistered more than once, and her back ached by the end of most days, but there was a strange comfort in the routine. No one at the kennels cared about bloodlines or the choosing ceremony. They cared whether the pups were fed and the gates were locked. She built walls around herself without realizing she was doing it. She kept her answers short when the few wolves who visited the kennels tried to make conversation. She avoided the training yard entirely, choosing instead to take the longer path around the eastern fence whenever she needed to move supplies. She learned to laugh quickly and sharply when someone brought up the rejection, using humor as a shield before anyone else could use the memory as a weapon. And she never, not once, looked directly into the eyes of any wolf who might carry news back to the Alpha King. Damien Ashworth, meanwhile, was falling apart in ways only his closest wolves noticed. He sat through council meetings with his expression carefully composed, nodding at the right moments, offering commands when required, but Owen had begun to notice the small signs of a king unraveling. Damien barely ate. He slept even less. He had always been a controlled and steady leader, someone whose calm presence settled the pack during difficult decisions. But in the weeks following the rejection, that calm had become brittle, stretched thin over something raw underneath. The council pressed him harder than ever about the Thornwood Alliance, a neighboring pack whose alpha had been sending increasingly formal messages about a potential marriage between Damien and one of Thornwood's daughters. Damien listened to the proposals with growing irritation, snapping at council members who had never seen him lose his patience before. "We need this alliance," one elder reminded him during a particularly tense meeting. "Thornwood's territory borders 3 rogue clans that have grown bold in recent months. A marriage bond would secure our northern border permanently." "I understand the strategic value," Damien said through gritted teeth. "I do not need it repeated to me every single day." The elder exchanged a glance with Owen, but said nothing further. Damien excused himself from the meeting shortly after, walking out into the cold air with his fists clenched at his sides, his wolf pacing restlessly beneath his skin, refusing to settle no matter how hard he tried to force calm into his own body. He told himself he was simply checking on pack business when he found his feet carrying him toward the eastern fence near the kennels for the 3rd time that week. He told himself the same thing the following week, and the week after that. He noticed things he had no reason to notice. The way Elena tied her hair back before feeding the pups, the quiet, steady way she moved through the kennels, never wasting motion, the soft sound of her voice when she thought no one else could hear her talking to the animals. He never approached her directly. He told himself it was because a king did not owe explanations to a kennel worker, though some smaller, more honest part of him knew the truth was far simpler. He was afraid of what he might say if he got too close, afraid the bond, torn as it was, might pull the words out of him before he could stop them. One afternoon, he found an excuse that felt almost reasonable. A gate near the eastern kennels had come loose from its hinges, and rather than sending one of the pack's builders to fix it, Damien found himself walking down with a toolbox in hand, telling himself the task required his personal attention. Elena was inside the nearest pen when he arrived, brushing straw into a neat pile, and she froze the moment she noticed him standing at the fence. Her eyes flicked toward him briefly before dropping back to the ground, her jaw tightening in a way that told him exactly how unwelcome his presence was. "The gate," Damien said, gesturing awkwardly toward the broken hinge, as though she might not have noticed the reason for his visit. "I can see that," Elena replied, her voice flat. She did not look at him again as she continued her work, moving further away, putting as much distance between them as the small pen allowed. Damien crouched by the gate and began working, his hands steady despite the storm building inside his chest. The silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, broken only by the sound of his tools and the soft rustle of straw beneath Elena's boots. He wanted to say something, anything, to fill the space, but every sentence he considered felt inadequate against the weight of what he had done to her. "You didn't have to come fix it yourself," Elena finally said, breaking the silence without turning to face him. "I'm sure you have more important things to attend to as Alpha King." There was no missing the bitterness laced through her words, and Damien could not blame her for it. "I wanted to make sure it was done properly," he said, the excuse sounding weak even to his own ears. Elena let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right, because the fate of the entire pack rests on one broken gate hinge." Damien said nothing, finishing his work in silence, though he noticed she stayed nearby the entire time, never quite leaving despite her clear discomfort. When he finally stood and gathered his tools, he allowed himself one look at her, taking in the tired lines around her eyes, the guarded set of her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone prepared to be hurt again at any moment. "Elena," he said quietly, her name feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth after weeks of silence. She stiffened but did not turn around. "I know an apology means nothing after what I did," Damien continued, the words coming out slower than he intended, unpracticed and raw. "But I am sorry." "Save it," Elena said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the cold air between them. "I don't need your apology. I need you to leave me alone." Damien nodded once, though she could not see the gesture, and turned to walk away, the ache in his chest deepening with every step that carried him further from her. He told himself he would listen to her request. He told himself he would stop finding reasons to visit the kennels. He broke that promise within 3 days. The visits continued in small, careful increments over the following weeks. He brought extra feed when supplies ran low. He repaired a section of fencing that had not actually needed repairing. He found himself lingering near the training yard whenever he knew her chores might bring her close enough to see, though he never approached directly again after that first conversation. Elena, for her part, never softened toward him, maintaining a careful distance that made her feelings unmistakably clear, though Damien noticed she stopped avoiding the eastern path entirely, no longer taking the long route around simply to escape the possibility of seeing him. Neither of them spoke about the bond. Neither of them spoke about the ceremony, or the rejection, or the ache that clearly lingered in both their chests, visible in the careful way they moved around each other, always aware, always circling something neither was ready to name aloud. Meanwhile, the pressure from the Thornwood Alliance only grew heavier. Messages arrived weekly, each one more insistent than the last, until finally word came that the Thornwood Alpha himself intended to travel to Blackthorn territory to finalize the marriage proposal in person. Damien received the news with a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with strategic concerns, and everything to do with the growing, undeniable truth he had been avoiding since the moment Elena Marsh walked through those hall doors. He did not want a marriage built on alliances and borders. He wanted the woman at the kennels who spoke gently to frightened pups and refused to let him apologize his way back into her good graces. But wanting something and being allowed to have it, he was quickly learning, were two very different things when you were born to lead a pack rather than yourself. The morning Callum Reyes arrived at Blackthorn territory, the entire pack seemed to hold its breath. Word had spread quickly through the ranks that the Thornwood Alpha was coming to finalize the marriage alliance, and wolves gathered at windows and doorways to catch a glimpse of the visiting leader as his procession moved through the main gates. Elena heard the commotion from the kennels, but did not think much of it beyond a passing curiosity. Pack politics had never been her concern, and she had learned quickly that the less attention she drew to herself, the easier her days became. She continued her chores as usual, unaware that the visiting Alpha's arrival would soon change the careful, guarded life she had built for herself. Callum Reyes was not what most wolves expected from a rival pack leader. He was younger than Damien, quick to smile, with an easy charm that put nervous wolves at ease within moments of meeting him. He greeted the Blackthorn Council with warmth, complimented the pack's territory, and moved through the formal introductions with practiced grace. But beneath the charm, Callum was sharp-eyed and observant, noticing details others missed. He noticed, almost immediately, that Damien Ashworth did not carry himself like a king preparing for a marriage he wanted. During the formal dinner held in his honor, Callum watched Damien push food around his plate without eating, watched him glance toward the door more than once as though expecting someone else to walk through it, watched the tightness around his eyes that no amount of practiced composure could fully hide. Something was wrong, and Callum, ever curious, intended to find out exactly what. The following morning, while touring the pack's territory as part of the formal alliance proceedings, Callum found an excuse to separate from his escort near the training yards, claiming interest in the pack's defensive structures. It was there, walking along the eastern path, that he first saw Elena. She was carrying feed toward the kennels, her sleeves rolled up, straw clinging to her boots, entirely unaware that she had caught the attention of a visiting alpha. Callum stopped walking, watching her for a long moment before approaching with an easy smile. "You must be new," he said, falling into step beside her without invitation. "I don't recognize you from the formal introductions." Elena eyed him warily, immediately recognizing the fine quality of his clothing despite his casual manner. "I work the kennels," she said simply. "I wasn't part of any formal introductions." "Ah." Callum's eyes flicked briefly toward her, taking in details with the same sharp attention he applied to everything else. "A rogue, then. Blackthorn takes in more outsiders than most packs. It's one of the things I've always respected about Damien's leadership." Elena said nothing, continuing toward the kennels with her feed, though Callum matched her pace easily. "I'm Callum," he offered, when she did not ask, "visiting from Thornwood." Elena's steps faltered slightly at the name, though she quickly recovered, keeping her expression carefully neutral. So this was the alpha her king was meant to marry. She felt something twist uncomfortably in her chest, an emotion she refused to examine too closely. "Elena," she said finally, seeing no reason to withhold her own name. Callum smiled, clearly pleased by the small exchange. Over the following days, he found reasons to return to the kennels, engaging Elena in conversation whenever their paths crossed. He was charming without being overwhelming, curious without being invasive, and Elena found herself, despite her careful walls, gradually softening toward the easy company he offered. It had been so long since anyone had simply talked to her without expectation or judgment. Word of the visiting alpha's frequent visits to the kennels traveled quickly through the pack, as such things always did, and it did not take long for the news to reach Damien. He received the information from Owen during a routine briefing, delivered in the careful, neutral tone his beta had perfected over years of managing Damien's temper. "The Thornwood Alpha has been spending time at the Eastern Kennels," Owen said, speaking with the new kennel worker. Damien's hand tightened around the report he had been reading, though his face remained carefully controlled. "Is that relevant to the Alliance proceedings?" "Perhaps not," Owen said, watching his alpha's reaction closely, "though I thought you should know." Damien said nothing further, dismissing Owen with a curt nod, but the news settled into his chest like a stone, heavy and unwelcome. He told himself it should not matter. He had rejected the bond himself, had chosen the alliance over the pull of fate, and he had no right to feel anything at all about who spent time in Elena's company. He told himself this repeatedly over the following days, and found the reasoning grew less convincing each time he attempted it. The breaking point came during a formal gathering held to celebrate the progress of the alliance negotiations. Damien had excused himself from the main hall briefly, seeking air and distance from the endless discussions of borders and marriage contracts, and found his feet carrying him, as they so often did, toward the eastern path. He arrived just in time to see Callum Reyes standing close to Elena near the training yard fence, both of them laughing at something, Callum's hand resting lightly on her arm in a gesture of easy familiarity. Something inside Damien snapped. He crossed the distance before he had fully decided to move, his voice carrying an authority that drew the attention of several nearby wolves. "Reyes, a word." Callum turned, unbothered by the interruption, though his eyes carried a knowing glint that told Damien he had noticed exactly what effect the scene had produced. "Of course," Callum said smoothly, stepping away from Elena with deliberate slowness. "I was simply getting acquainted with your pack." "You have a marriage alliance to discuss," Damien said, his voice tight with a control that was rapidly slipping. "I suggest you focus your attention there." Elena, caught between the two alphas, felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger in equal measure. She was not property to be argued over, and she resented the implication that her presence had become some kind of battleground between two powerful men. "I am perfectly capable of speaking with whoever I choose," she said sharply, drawing both men's attention back to her. "Neither of you needs to discuss me, as though I'm not standing right here." The words hit their mark, and Damien had the grace to look momentarily ashamed, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully ease. Callum, for his part, looked almost amused by the entire exchange, offering Elena a small, apologetic nod before excusing himself back toward the main hall, leaving Damien and Elena alone at the fence. The silence between them stretched painfully long. "You have no right to be jealous," Elena finally said, her voice quieter now but no less firm. "You rejected me, Damien. You don't get to decide who I spend my time with." Damien opened his mouth to respond, though no adequate words came, and before he could find his voice, a distant howl cut through the evening air, sharp and urgent, a warning call that immediately drew both their attention toward the northern border. Within seconds, more howls joined the first, and the pack's warning system spread the alarm through the entire territory. Rogue wolves had been spotted crossing the border, and from the tone of the calls, this was no simple scouting party. Damien's expression shifted instantly from wounded frustration to commanding focus. "Get inside," he told Elena, already moving toward the source of the alarm. "Now." Elena did not argue, though her heart pounded with a fear that had nothing to do with the earlier confrontation. She turned to head toward the main buildings as instructed, but the chaos that followed happened too quickly for careful plans. The rogue wolves, drawn by rumors of an unclaimed mate bond left vulnerable at the edge of the territory, had specifically targeted the eastern kennels, believing the area's lighter patrol presence would offer easy access. Elena found herself caught between the fleeing pack members and the advancing threat, the training yard suddenly filled with snarling wolves and panicked shouts. She turned to run toward the main buildings, but a rogue wolf cut off her path, teeth bared, eyes wild with the desperation of a creature with nothing left to lose. Elena stumbled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs, searching frantically for any escape route. The wolf lunged. Damien moved faster than thought aloud, closing the distance between them in a blur of motion, his own wolf breaking free of the careful control he had maintained for weeks. He collided with the rogue mid-lunge, the two bodies crashing to the ground in a tangle of claws and snarls, and Elena scrambled backward, pressing herself against the fence as the fight unfolded before her. Damien's wolf fought with a ferocity born of pure instinct, protecting the mate his rational mind had rejected but his deeper nature refused to abandon. Two more rogues emerged from the shadows, drawn by the commotion, and for a terrifying moment, Elena feared the numbers would overwhelm him. Pack wolves arrived within moments, Owen leading a small group that quickly turned the tide of the confrontation, but Damien had already dispatched the first threat and turned to face the second attacker without hesitation, his movements sharp and decisive despite the blood already staining his fur. The fight ended almost as quickly as it began, the rogue wolves either fleeing or subdued by the arriving reinforcements. But in the final moments of the confrontation, one of the retreating rogues lashed out, catching Damien across the side before disappearing into the darkness beyond the border. Damien shifted back to his human form immediately, pressing a hand against the wound at his side, though his first movement was toward Elena rather than toward any assistance for himself. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough, his eyes scanning her frantically for any sign of injury. "I'm fine," Elena said, though her voice shook with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing," Damien said, though the paleness spreading across his face suggested otherwise. Owen arrived quickly, taking in the scene with a sharp assessment, immediately calling for the pack healer, while Damien continued to insist he was fine, his attention still fixed entirely on Elena rather than his own injury. When the healer arrived and attempted to guide Damien toward the medical building, he refused to move until he had confirmed with his own eyes that Elena was truly unharmed. "Let them treat your wound," Elena finally said, her earlier anger softening into something gentler at the sight of him swaying slightly on his feet. "Please." Damien looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded passing across his features before he finally allowed the healer to guide him away, though he glanced back toward Elena more than once as he went, as though unwilling to let her out of his sight even now. Elena stood alone at the fence long after he had disappeared into the medical building, her heart still racing, her mind replaying the image of him throwing himself between her and danger without a single moment of hesitation, despite everything that stood unresolved between them. She did not understand what it meant. She only knew that something had shifted in the space of a single terrifying evening, and she was no longer certain the walls she had built around her heart would hold much longer against the pull of a bond that refused to stay broken. Elena found herself outside the medical building long after the healer had finished treating Damien's wound, unable to make herself leave despite every instinct urging her toward the safety of distance. She told herself she was simply waiting to confirm he would recover, nothing more, though the tightness in her chest suggested her reasons ran deeper than she wanted to admit. When Owen finally emerged, he found her sitting on the steps outside, her arms wrapped around her knees, in a posture that reminded him uncomfortably of a wounded animal deciding whether to trust an approaching stranger. "He's asking for you," Owen said quietly. Elena's head snapped up. "He should be resting." "He will rest," Owen said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face, "once he knows you're safe with his own eyes, rather than second-hand reports." Elena hesitated only a moment before rising and following Owen inside. She found Damien propped against a stack of pillows, a bandage wrapped tightly around his ribs, his face pale but his eyes sharp and alert the moment she entered the room. Something in his shoulders loosened visibly at the sight of her, as though he had been holding his breath until she appeared. "You shouldn't have moved," Elena said, settling into the chair beside his bed without quite deciding to do so. "I needed to see you were unharmed," Damien said simply, as though this were an obvious and unquestionable fact, rather than a confession. Elena studied him for a long moment, the events of the evening still raw and unsettled inside her. The rejection, the jealousy, the fight, the way he had thrown himself between her and danger without a single moment of hesitation. It all sat uncomfortably alongside the careful walls she had spent weeks constructing, and she found herself unable to maintain the distance any longer. "Why did you reject me?" she asked finally, the question she had carried silently for weeks, finally breaking free. "Tell me the truth, not politics, the real reason." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as though gathering the courage to speak. "My father made me promise," he said finally, "before he died, that I would secure this pack's future through a strategic alliance. He believed emotion had no place in leadership decisions. He believed the mate bond was a risk the pack could not afford, especially with rogue clans growing bolder along our borders." "So you rejected fate to keep a promise to a dead man," Elena said, her voice hollow. "Yes," Damien admitted, meeting her eyes now, unflinching despite the shame evident in his expression. "And it was the worst decision I have ever made." Elena felt something crack further inside her chest, anger and hurt tangled together with a longing she had tried desperately to suppress. "Do you have any idea what that rejection cost me?" she asked, her voice rising slightly despite her attempts at control. "I had nothing, Damien. No pack, no family, no place in this world. I came here hoping only for a chance to belong somewhere, and instead you tore something out of me in front of hundreds of witnesses and left me to piece myself back together alone." "I know," Damien said quietly. "I have thought of nothing else since that night." "That's not enough," Elena said, standing abruptly, her hands trembling with the force of emotions she had held back for weeks. "You don't get to feel guilty in private and expect that to fix what happened in public. You broke something in front of the entire pack, Damien. You don't get to mend it with quiet apologies delivered when it's convenient for you." Damien flinched, though he did not look away from her. "You're right," he said. "I have no excuse that makes this acceptable." "Then why haven't you told your counsel you refuse to marry someone else?" Elena demanded, the question hanging heavy in the space between them. "Why are you still allowing the Thornwood Alliance to move forward if you regret rejecting me this much?" Damien opened his mouth, though the answer that came was not the one Elena needed to hear. "It isn't that simple," he said. The Alliance protects thousands of wolves along our northern border. I cannot simply abandon that responsibility because of my own feelings. Elena felt something inside her go cold and still. So your feelings matter enough to regret rejecting me, she said slowly, but not enough to actually change anything. Elena. No, she said, cutting him off, her voice steady, despite the tears threatening at the edges of her control. I understand perfectly. You'll keep feeling guilty, and I'll keep living with what that guilt cost me, and nothing will actually change. That's not an apology, Damien. That's just you wanting to feel better about your own choices. She turned and left the room before he could respond, ignoring his voice calling her name behind her, ignoring Owen's concerned expression as she pushed past him toward the exit. She did not stop walking until she reached the small room she had been given near the kennels, and there, finally, she allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall freely, the weight of weeks of carefully maintained composure finally breaking under the pressure of an argument that had resolved nothing. Damien remained in the medical room long after she left, staring at the closed door, the ache in his chest far sharper than the physical wound at his side. She was right, and he knew it, though the knowledge did nothing to ease the impossible tangle of promises and responsibilities that had led him to this moment. Over the following days, the council grew increasingly insistent about finalizing the Thornwood alliance, sensing perhaps that further delay might allow the growing tension between Damien and Elena to derail the carefully negotiated agreement entirely. A formal ceremony was announced, moved up from its original timeline, scheduled to take place within the week, and Damien found himself trapped by the very promise he had made to secure his pack's safety. He tried, more than once, to seek Elena out, hoping to find some way to bridge the distance that had opened between them, but she avoided him, with the same careful precision she had once used to avoid the training yard entirely. She took the longer paths again. She kept her answers short whenever their paths accidentally crossed. The walls she had briefly lowered during their conversation in the medical room had risen again, higher and more fortified than before. Elena spent those final days wrestling with a decision she had never wanted to face. She could stay and watch the ceremony unfold, watch Damien bind himself formally to another woman, while the torn remains of their bond continued to ache in her chest. Or she could leave the territory entirely, disappearing into whatever uncertain future awaited a rogue with nowhere else to go. She chose to leave. It was not a decision made lightly. She had grown to care for the kennels, for Harold's quiet acceptance, for the small measure of stability she had built for herself despite everything. But staying meant enduring a pain she was not certain she could survive, watching the man her very soul had recognized bind himself to someone else through political necessity rather than fate. She packed her few belongings the night before the ceremony was scheduled to take place, moving quietly through the darkened kennels one final time, saying a silent goodbye to the pups who had listened to her secrets without judgment during the loneliest weeks of her life. Harold found her near the gate just before dawn, his expression knowing despite her attempts to explain her sudden departure. "You don't have to explain," Harold said gently. "I've seen enough heartbreak in my years to recognize it when it walks past me carrying a travel bag." "Thank you," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion, "for giving me a place to belong, even if it was only for a little while." Harold nodded, offering no further argument, and Elena disappeared into the early morning light, leaving Blackthorn territory behind just as the pack began stirring for a ceremony that would seal an alliance built on everything except the truth Damien had finally admitted to her in a quiet medical room, too late and not enough. The morning of the alliance ceremony arrived with a clear sky and a cold wind, and the great hall of Blackthorn territory filled quickly with wolves from both packs, all gathered to witness the formal joining of Damien Ashworth and the Thornwood delegation. Elena's absence, though not yet widely known, sat like an invisible weight in the room, felt keenly by only a handful of wolves who understood its significance. Damien stood at the front of the hall in formal attire, his expression carefully composed for the benefit of the gathered crowd, though anyone who looked closely might have noticed the tension coiled tightly in his shoulders, the restless energy barely contained beneath his controlled exterior. He had sent word to the Eastern Kennels that morning, hoping perhaps for one final conversation before the ceremony sealed his fate irreversibly. The message returned swiftly, and with it, news that shattered whatever composure he had managed to build. Elena was gone. Harold's report, delivered quietly by a runner who found Damien just moments before the ceremony was set to begin, described her departure in simple, unembellished terms. She had left before dawn, taking only what she could carry, offering no destination and no promise of return. Damien felt the world narrow to a single, sharp point of understanding. He had spent weeks caught between duty and desire, convincing himself there was still time to find some resolution, some path that honored both his father's dying wish and the bond fate had chosen for him. He had been wrong. There had never been time at all, and his hesitation had cost him the one thing he could not survive losing. The council members near him noticed his sudden stillness, exchanging concerned glances as the formal procession began moving toward the front of the hall, the Thornwood delegation approaching with Callum Reyes at its head, ready to finalize an alliance that suddenly felt like ash in Damien's mouth. He looked out at the assembled crowd, at the expectant faces of two packs waiting to witness a joining that would secure borders and satisfy strategic necessities, and he understood, with sudden and absolute clarity, that he could not go through with it, not because the alliance lacked value, but because he had spent his entire life honoring promises made by others, while ignoring the one truth his own heart had recognized, the moment Elena Marsh walked through those doors months before. "Stop," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, silencing the murmurs of the gathered crowd instantly. The council members froze. Callum Reyes, halfway through the formal procession, paused with an expression of genuine curiosity rather than alarm. "I cannot complete this ceremony," Damien continued, stepping forward, his voice growing steadier with each word despite the enormity of what he was about to admit in front of both packs. "Not because Thornwood lacks honor, or because this alliance lacks value, but because I have already been claimed by fate, and I rejected that claim out of fear and misplaced duty. I will not compound that mistake by binding myself to another out of the same fear." Gasps spread through the hall, followed by urgent whispers, though Damien did not stop to gauge the reaction, pressing forward with the confession he should have made weeks earlier. "My mate is a woman named Elena Marsh," he continued, his voice unwavering despite the weight of every eye in the hall fixed upon him. "I rejected her the night she arrived at this territory, believing I owed my father a promise that mattered more than what my own soul had already chosen. I was wrong. I have spent every day since that rejection understanding exactly how wrong I was, and I will not spend the rest of my life compounding that error by marrying someone else to satisfy political necessity." Callum Reyes, rather than reacting with anger or offense, offered a slow, understanding smile, stepping forward calmly despite the shocked silence surrounding him. "I suspected as much," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "I have watched you these past weeks, Damien, and a man preparing to marry with a full heart does not carry himself the way you have carried yourself since my arrival. I apologize for the position this places you in," Damien said, though relief was already beginning to loosen the tension in his chest. "Don't," Callum said, waving off the apology with easy grace. "Thornwood values honesty more than forced alliances. Besides," he added, a hint of humor returning to his expression, "I've met your Elena. She deserves a mate who chooses her without hesitation, not one who settles for her out of guilt, while marrying elsewhere out of duty." The Thornwood council members exchanged glances among themselves, though none voiced immediate objection, understanding perhaps that an alliance built on Damien's genuine goodwill and gratitude might prove more valuable long-term than one built on forced obligation and resentment. Owen stepped forward quickly, already anticipating his alpha's next move. "She left before dawn," he said quietly, for Damien's ears alone. "Harold said she was heading toward the southern trade routes, likely trying to reach the coastal territories before nightfall." Damien did not wait for further permission or ceremony. He moved through the stunned crowd with single-minded purpose, shedding his formal attire as he went, and within moments, he had shifted into his wolf form, racing out through the hall's rear doors and into the cold morning air, driven by an urgency that eclipsed every careful, controlled instinct he had spent his entire life cultivating. He tracked her scent along the southern paths, following the faint trail that grew stronger as the morning wore on, his heart pounding with a fear far greater than anything he had felt during the rogue attack weeks earlier. He could survive a physical wound. He was not certain he could survive losing her permanently, not after finally understanding exactly what he had nearly thrown away. He found her several hours later, resting beside a small stream at the edge of Blackthorn's southern border, her travel bag set beside her, her expression distant and exhausted as she stared out at the flowing water. She heard him approach before she saw him, recognizing his scent instantly despite months of trying to forget it. "You should be at your ceremony," she said, not turning around, her voice carefully flat, despite the way her hands trembled slightly against her knees. "There is no ceremony," Damien said, shifting back into his human form and stepping closer, though he kept enough distance to respect whatever boundaries she still needed. "I stopped it." Elena turned then, disbelief evident across her features. "You stopped it? In front of both packs?" "In front of both packs," Damien confirmed, closing the remaining distance between them slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished. "I told them the truth, that I had already been claimed by fate, and that I would not spend my life honoring a promise to the dead, while ignoring the one true thing my own heart has ever recognized." Elena stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any lingering doubt that might suggest this was simply another moment of guilt rather than genuine choice. She found none. His eyes held nothing but a raw, unguarded certainty she had never seen from him before, not during the ceremony, not during their private conversation in the medical room, not even during the desperate fight that had left him wounded protecting her. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why not weeks ago, when it would have spared us both so much pain?" "Because I was a coward," Damien admitted, his voice rough with an honesty that cost him something visible in the confession. "I convinced myself duty mattered more than truth, that honoring my father's wishes justified ignoring what fate had already decided. I was wrong, Elena, and I understand if that truth arrives too late for you to forgive." Elena studied him for a long moment, the weight of weeks of hurt and longing tangled together inside her chest, refusing to resolve easily despite the sincerity evident in his every word. "It's not that simple," she said finally. "You can't undo what happened in that hall with a single grand gesture, no matter how public or how brave." "I know," Damien said. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm asking for the chance to prove, every single day from now on, that the bond fate gave us deserves better than the fear that made me reject it in the first place." The silence between them stretched long, filled with everything neither of them had said during the difficult weeks that had passed since that first terrible night. Elena felt the familiar torn ache in her chest, the remnant of a bond that had never fully healed, and for the first time since the rejection, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like for that ache to finally close, instead of simply persisting, unresolved and painful. "If we do this," she said slowly, "it has to be real. No more hiding behind duty. No more choosing politics over honesty. I won't survive another rejection, Damien, not even a quiet one." "I understand," Damien said, and something in his voice carried a certainty that finally reached the guarded places inside her chest that had refused to trust him since that first devastating night. "I am asking you to come back, Elena, not as a kennel worker hiding at the edges of my territory, but as my mate, claimed properly, in front of the same pack that watched me break your heart." Elena felt tears gather at the edges of her eyes, though these carried none of the bitter grief of the tears she had shed weeks earlier. "You're certain," she said, needing to hear it once more, needing the confirmation before she allowed herself to hope. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Damien said, closing the final distance between them and reaching for her hand, his fingers trembling slightly with the weight of the moment. "Come home, Elena. Let me finish what fate started the moment you walked through those doors." Elena looked at him for a long, searching moment, weighing every hurt against every genuine sign of change she had witnessed over the difficult weeks since her arrival, and finally, slowly, she nodded, allowing him to draw her hand into his own. They returned to Blackthorn territory together as the sun began its slow descent toward evening, walking side by side rather than as king and rejected outsider, and word of Damien's confession had already spread through the pack by the time they arrived, filling the great hall once more with wolves eager to witness whatever came next. The hall fell silent the moment they entered together, the same silence that had greeted Elena's arrival months earlier, though this time the atmosphere carried anticipation rather than judgment. Damien led her to the same platform where he had once spoken the words that shattered her, and this time he turned to face her directly, his hands steady as he took both of hers in his own. "Elena Marsh," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent hall, "I claim you as my mate, fully and completely, before this entire pack and any who would question the truth. Fate has already written between us." The bond that had lived torn and aching in Elena's chest for months finally knitted back together, whole and steady, the sensation flooding through her with a warmth that erased every lingering trace of the pain she had carried since that first terrible night. She felt Damien's own relief mirror hers through the strengthening bond, the two currents merging into something neither had fully understood until this exact moment. "I accept you," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tears now falling freely down her face, tears of relief rather than grief. "Fully and completely." The hall erupted into sound around them, wolves from both packs cheering the completion of a bond that had nearly been lost to fear and misplaced duty, but Elena barely heard any of it, her attention entirely fixed on the man before her, on the golden certainty in his eyes that had finally replaced the cold rejection of months earlier. Damien pulled her close, and this time, no one in that hall misunderstood what she meant to him.